I, as a meat processor, we as a meats industry, we've had to reevaluate how we cut that. And so I do a lot of cutting demonstrations with BAM, the beef alternative merchandising, the ribeye fillets, the cap steaks, and all that stuff that I can peel off that ribeye because I feel my job is to get that product in the shopping cart. And that goes back to that generation thing as well. The generation that can afford those ribeyes are your baby boomers, but they're not looking for a 16-inch ribeye. They're looking for something, a little bit smaller. They're becoming more health conscious as well.
All right, Greg, thanks for coming on the show. And so today we're glad to have Dr. Gregg Rentfrow. So Greg is a meat scientist located at University of Kentucky. Greg, kind of give you your background of what you do, how you got there.
Well, I've been in the meats industry for 36 years. As a retail meat cutter, I started into this. A little bit different path than a lot of folks. Originally from Illinois, uh, did my bachelor's and master's at the University of Illinois, my PhD at the University of Missouri. Been here at UK for 18 years as the extension meat specialist. Do a lot of programming. I teach a lot of people how to cut meat. We got a meat cutting school here. Work with the 4-H and Youth Country Ham Project, and just basic extension stuff is what I do, as well as teach undergraduates and graduate students.
Yeah, how did you get into meat scientists? What was the drive of this is really what I want to do?
Yeah, it was like I said, my path is a little bit different than a lot of people. A lot of my colleagues got into it by taking a class in college, or they were on a judging team, and I was that way too. I was on the University of Illinois meats judging team, but for me, this is dating me tremendous. I was working in a grocery store and bagging groceries back when you actually put groceries in a paper bag and you carried them out to people's car. And my dad is a retired ag teacher, and he had a student who was running the meat department. He says, "Hey, come work for me." And my educational career path wasn't quite going the way I wanted it to, or my parents and my dad thought it should be going. And he said, "Well, you seem to like this meat stuff. You ever heard of meat science?" And I said, "No." And he shipped me off to Illinois to talk with Dr. Tom Carr and Dr. Floyd McKeith, and they inspired me. I came back a couple years later and entered the University of Illinois after a couple of years in junior college, and that's how it started. And like I said, PhD at U of I, Mizzou, or bachelor's and master's U of I, PhD at Mizzou. Been here at UK 18 years.
So over the last 18 years, you've probably noticed a change in consumer demand, consumer perception, and so let's talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah, it's really, I kind of look at things a little bit different than I think a lot of people do because I worked 14 years in retail and as a retail meat cutter. And when I first started in the industry cutting meat, you cut beef, pork, and lamb.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I came in, if I remember right, the tail end of cutting chicken. And now you get chicken prepackaged. I don't know. I'm amazed at the number of people want me to teach them how to cut up a chicken. But now you go in the grocery store and it's not only beef, pork, and lamb. It's natural. It's organic. It's grass
Right,
finished. Grain finish. It's and there's so many more choices we have. And
right.
and I really got interested. I always kind of kept that retail, mindset when I look at things. And then I got really interested in how different generations, and that kind of what spurred that one on is I took a kind of when I started my career here at UK to better learn how to teach my students. Another professor was having a class on, how to teach, undergraduates and graduate students and so on. And I took that, and one of the things we talked about is the generations, baby boomers, Gen X, millennial, and how they learn differently. And then that kind of fed into my curiosity. I thought, okay, if baby boomers and Gen Xers and millennials, and now we have Generation Z, if they learn differently, I wonder if they buy food, they buy meat, they eat differently, and so on and so forth. And that has been kind of a side little project of mine of going down that rabbit hole and learning as much as I can about what makes Gen Xers and millennials and so on, but even how they buy food and eat and so on. It's really fascinating.
So what has that those changes been? What are they wanting today versus, later generations that really picked up? But
Yeah, the one thing that I've learned and I've discovered is how much we as a society, and it seems to progress with the generations, how we don't know as much about food as we thought we did. I don't know how else to put that. Like my dad and my mom, they're baby boomers,
mm,
and they don't really fall for much. That's one of those characteristics of baby boomers is they understand stuff. And my dad will go into a grocery store and he'll see these niche products and he's like, "Oh, it's just slick marketing."
yeah,
And then you get down into the millennials and the generation Z especially, and they're just we pick on them, but we're just like them because whenever they want information, they go to this thing. The challenge of being a professor and with these teaching millennials and now generation Z is trying to explain to them the difference between a good source of information and propaganda. And I don't know if propaganda is the right word to put in there, but that's the one thing I've noticed over the years is how fascinating people are to learn about it. And a lot of times my job is just dispelling urban legends or myths or whatever we have about not only the meats industry but food in general. And it really came to a head during the pandemic. That really
yeah.
kind of spurred things on as well.
From an extension side, that is one of our biggest challenges sometimes is that, our stakeholders are very diverse, and
Yes,
that's including the consumer side. And a lot of times we're so focused on the producer side, but consumers are one of those stakeholders that we serve as well. And there is a lot of misinformation out there.
it is. And like you said, consumers and then farmers in general, producers in general. I kind of joke. We have a master cattleman program here, and I always find it interesting because I'll get them down in the meats lab, and I'll give them kind of the Reader's Digest version of USDA beef quality grades,
Yep.
and then I'll end it with saying, okay, before you heard me give you this breakdown of quality grading, how many of you heard of the words prime, choice, and select in relationship to beef? And about every hand goes up. And then I asked the next question. It's like, okay, how many of you understood what that meant where you could explain that to somebody and so on and so forth? And then all of a sudden the floor and the ceiling get really, really interesting to a lot of them. And then I tease them, but it's
Hmm.
chastise them a little bit as well. It's like, this is your product
Yep.
and you don't understand that. And I think what it is, and I could be wrong on this, but sometimes I think our farmers, they get so focused on their aspect
Right.
of the industry and they don't kind of see things from a bigger standpoint. What you're talking is really neat, but that meat stuff, it doesn't affect me. And I'm like, you got to see the bigger picture.
That is a challenge. We're not as integrated as the poultry side, or swine side, but
No.
but all of that still influences the cow calf producer, and they really need to know the downstream effects of their choices at the farm, their ranch influences that downstream, and a lot of times that comes back and influences their profitability as well. Is
Yeah.
that if they're making poor decisions, having poor meat quality, poor performance, sooner or later they're going to be discounted because it's a known deal as X, Y, and Z's farm ranch. Their animals perform this way. And so that's really important for them to understand the system that they're working in, and rather not just their little vacuum.
Yeah. And, one of the things that I also do, I tell folks, and sometimes I think, our farmers don't understand when you say this is the slaughter weight of our cattle, 14, 15, 1,600 pound monsters.
Yeah.
And we're getting them to that size and they're not fat. 20 years ago, you'd have said that you thought it was a fat. Now they're heavy muscled creatures.
Correct.
And from a meat standpoint, now all of a sudden, well, I had this conversation last week with one of our freshman classes. We had a beef animal come through the meats lab that the class got to look at. It had a 16-inch ribeye. You that's your dinner plate right there. You throw that thing on your dinner plate, that's right there. And I, as a meat processor, we as a meats industry, we've had to reevaluate how we cut that. And so I do a lot of cutting demonstrations with BAM, the beef alternative merchandising, the ribeye fillets, the cap steaks, and all that stuff that I can peel off that ribeye because I feel my job is to get that product in the shopping cart. And that goes back to that generation thing as well. The generation that can afford those ribeyes are your baby boomers, but they're not looking for a 16-inch ribeye. They're looking for something, a little bit smaller. They're becoming more health conscious as well. And I've had farmers that'll look at me and say, that's neat, but is that going in my pocket? Not directly, but my job is to create more demand for
Correct.
your product. So, and I tell my students, anybody can sell something. It's easy. The true art's getting them to come back.
Correct.
And just by changing cutting angles and reevaluating the way we fabricate that carcass, making those portion sizes smaller and consequently making not only those portion sizes smaller, nobody, I challenge anybody to tell me how much a pound of ground beef costs per pound. They know the total price. And so I
Yep.
got to put that total price down to get in that shopping cart and to get them coming back as well.
Yeah, I think you hit on a big problem that we're going to face sooner or later in the beef industry is cow size is way too big,
Yeah. The
and
big,
and we're increasing that cow size, and so those slaughter weights are climbing,
yeah.
and it's not uncommon, to be in that 1700 pound finishing realm of having a carcass weight of over 1100, 1200 pound carcass.
Oh yeah. I remember the last time I was in a major beef packing plant, I didn't see a carcass weight under 850 pounds.
Yep.
And if you back calculate, you are in that 15, 1600, 1700 pound weight range. And, the big guys, the big processors, I won't name them for obvious reasons, but they'll tell you, you know, I get more yield off those big carcasses, I get more sellable product off there. And I don't disagree with one
Right.
bit. And I take it a step further, and it's the same thing I drive to my students today. We've got a job. We've got to feed 9 billion people,
Right.
and we got to do it on a shrinking landmass. And that's what's drove a lot of this is
Yeah.
I still got a lot of people to feed. Cattle weights have got to get bigger. Chicken, we've seen poultry, their sizes getting bigger. Even pigs have gotten bigger as well. And it's just because we don't have the room
Hmm.
to raise our livestock the way we used to.
Yeah, and it's interesting, you brought up of the baby boomers, wanting that smaller ribeye
Yeah.
and that's why a lot of these guys are going to direct farm operations is because they're finishing and they're killing at a smaller weight. And that really fits that niche a lot better for them is as a family unit, we can't afford to buy or even have a, half a side of a 1200 pound carcass.
Yeah. And that's, that feeds into that generation thing as well, because when I go into, these folks, it's really kind of fascinating where they want a side of beef, especially during the pandemic. That was really
Yep.
interesting. And I remember growing up, I'm a Gen Xer. We had a deep freeze in the basement. I don't know if that exists as common as it was when I was a kid. So a lot of people, their refrigerator or their freezers, what's above the refrigerator, and you can't put a side of beef. You can't put a quarter of a beef in there. And it's funny. I didn't realize this. My students sometimes teach me more than I teach them. And last semester, I've shown some of my students these new beef cuts, and one girl in my class, because that's basically what I have is girls, and she goes, "I like that ribeye fillet. my dad eats ribeyes, but I'm going to eat a ribeye fillet. So it's like, they were breaking away from
Right,
what their
right.
parents, something different from there as well. But yeah, that's, you talk about, what changes have I seen? The local food movement. We have the Kentucky Proud program here. Other states have their own version of it. We now have a classification of consumer called localvores. And we kind of say that tongue in cheek, but I'm the same way. I'll never forget. This is Kentucky. We have a liquid beverage that is,
Hmm.
synonymous with Kentucky, and that's bourbon. And I saw a bourbon made that wasn't made in Kentucky, and I hearken back to what my our old governor, our previous governor, said. That's counterfeit bourbon right there. So
Yeah.
even we all do that kind of stuff. We all want to support the local farmer and the local products. There's no doubt about that.
But there's also misconceptions sometimes with some of those concepts. That beef is better
Yeah,
or it's higher quality, and sometimes it can be,
yeah,
right? 'Cause
yeah.
if you have a rancher or farmer that really knows how to feed animals, you can get into that of
Oh
it
yeah.
is. But there's a lot of misconceptions of buying local, buying organic, buying natural. X, Y, and Z is much healthier, much better than going to Costco and buying from a store.
Yeah, you're right. And we ran into this situation about 10, 12 years ago here in Kentucky. Somehow it got out to farmers that you couldn't be part of the Kentucky Proud program unless you were organic. And
Mhm.
that couldn't be further from the truth. And so that a lot of us that work with the Kentucky Proud program, and farmers that are getting into the local food movement, that was a challenge we had. Is no, you don't have to be organic, you just have to be local. And I'll argue with folks. I think a lot of times people are buying the story more so than they're buying the steak or the
Correct.
ground beef or whatever. They want to be able to sit down at a dinner party they're hosting and say, this came from this farm. It's just down the road. Their kids are involved in 4-H and FFA. It's a centennial farm. They want to be able to tell
Yes,
that story. And, quality is a weird word. It's
it
kind of like
is.
healthy. Everybody's got their different definitions of what it means to them.
Yep.
And if my opinion is, and I could be wrong, if you think local is a higher quality, cool. You're buying meat. That's all that matters.
Exactly.
So
Exactly. But I totally agree. As long as they're buying beef at
yeah,
the as I'm totally fine of where they're sourcing it and how they're buying it.
yeah,
Well, what gets under my skin is the mismarketing of some of those labeled products that are, let's take the poultry as the non-hormone added
yes, yes.
label, right? And so some of the mismarketing that leads to some of that gets under your skin of
Amen. I can tell you right now, there's nothing that uh, bothers me more is when, in order for you to sell your product, you have to bash
correct.
the other product in order to sell. I can't stand that. I don't like it, but it happens. It really does. And I don't know what to do about it. I've been struggling with it for 18 years, but, you know, yeah, you're right. I could go on, but then probably have to go to sensitivity training afterward. So,
Yeah. Let's move over to meat cutting, and you
yeah,
and you you mentioned UK's meat cutting school, and I think there's a big need for that. I know there's a lot of producers that are really interested in that, of because they may be selling, some beef on the side, or
yeah, yeah.
and so I think there's a lot of interest, and I think a lot of consumers should go through a meat cutting opportunity as well.
Yeah, farmers as well,
Yeah.
because yeah, like I said, I've that's how I cut my teeth in the business is cutting meat, and I decided one of my programs in extension would be that, and in fact, I posted Monday, just Monday, our have two beef processing workshops and one pork processing workshop this summer. Posted them Monday. Yesterday at noon, they sold out.
Hmm.
They sold out, and that's the kind of the going rate there. And yeah, there is a need for skilled meat cutters. I'm not for sure what that need's going to look like in the future. During the pandemic, it was a big thing of trying to find people not only willing to work, but those folks like that. And I do a cutting school here at UK. I collaborate a lot with University of Maine, and I do meat cutting schools up there as well. In fact, in March I did a tribal one. That was interesting, working with some of the tribes that they have up there, Native American tribes, and they're kind of going through the same situation. I think a lot of ethnic and cultural groups go through, where the older generation kept on to the traditions, and then the newer generation kind of let them falter. Now we get into that again, that generation thing. That Generation Z is wanting to return back to
Hmm.
those old tribal roots, and so we did that as well. And the students we get, it's fascinating to me because I can see the change. I get some that are, hey, I want to learn this so I can start a different career. And we get a few of those folks. We get farmers that want to know more about it. One of the kind of most unique ones we had a few years ago was kind of like what my wife and I do for each other and our daughter. We've decided that we have enough crap in our house that instead of for Christmas and birthdays and anniversaries, we buy each other, experiences. Like, for example, my wife's Christmas present was we went to go see John Mellencamp. She's a big fan of John
Hmm.
Mellencamp.
Hmm.
My birthday present was the Blackstone Cherry, ZZ Top, Leonard Skinner concert. So, and this was one of those individuals whose wife bought him this, and
Hmm.
he spent 3 days with us learning how to cut meat and slaughter animals and so on. But what really gets me, and I started seeing this in Missouri, or excuse me, not in Missouri, but in Maine when one of our classes, and now we're starting to see it here in Kentucky as well, is the homesteaders, the off the grid people getting interested in it. And talking to my friend and colleague up at UMaine, Dr. Colt Knight, he said they get a lot of the off grid homesteader folks up in Maine. And I'm like, if I'm going to live off grid, Maine's the last place I'd want to live off grid. Like I talked to Colt last night and he said, yeah, we just got a foot and a half of snow. So, but yeah, those are the students we get, and it is one of those things of people are interested in it. I'm always amazed at how quick we can sell those workshops out.
So what kind of students are you getting that want to do this? Or are they, planning on going into the meat industry, or are they, someone's just from the ranch, someone from the farm that just have interest, or even consumers?
Yeah, all the above. To be honest with you, like I said, the homesteaders have been the kind of the steady flux in the last couple of years.
Yeah.
But a lot of times it is, like you said, farmers. I've had some folks that said, okay, I'm interested in starting my own processing facility. I don't know what I'm doing. And they come in and they go through the workshop. And the workshop is just designed to kind of introduce people to the skills and the concepts. Experience is the true teacher.
Right.
I often compare it to playing guitar. I decided that my midlife crisis was I was going to learn how to play the electric guitar, and me practicing 15 to 20 minutes a day. I'm learning, but as you can tell, I'm here talking to you and I'm not on tour of Metallica. So because I
Yeah.
don't do it as much as those guys do, and that's where the
Right.
the
Right.
true experience comes in. But it gets their feet wet where they say, okay, I see how you guys interact with the USDA. I see the USDA inspectors are involved in this. I see all that goes into it with the food safety plans and everything. And some of them come back and they say, I thought this was a good idea. I don't know if I want to do it. Others come back and say, this isn't as scary as I thought it would be. And so we
Hmm.
get a lot of those. And, student wise, our undergraduate population, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of them are female. I capped my class at 40 students, and a big class of boys for me is about 10 to 12. And a lot of those students are ag ed majors
Hmm.
that are learning this so they can go and teach that. Now we're starting to see, I'm actually working with a county right now of building up a meat science program at the high school levels as well.
That's great. So are you seeing I know here in Oregon we have an influx of mobile slaughter facilities.
Yeah.
Is that going on, and is there a lot of extension going that way as well, or?
Yeah, it's a little weird. Yeah, there's states where they don't have a lot of meat processors. Those are fairly
Mhm.
popular. I do know that there's some of our processors that do it, but they don't do it with USDA. There's
Mhm.
so many regulations. It goes from
Sure.
state to state to state. Like we have Kentucky State University, our partners over in Frankfurt. They with help with our poultry specialists, developed a mobile poultry slaughter unit. Well, in order to get it mobile, you have to have a docking station.
Mhm.
And then suddenly the docking station costs as much as they build the facility itself, and it became not as mobile as they thought it would be. We have over 100 meat processors in the state, so the whole mobile is not as popular as what a lot of folks do. But I actually helped some folks in Delaware design and build one, and did some training there years ago because they only have in that area they don't have very many meat processors, and there's a need. So it seems to go with where you don't have a lot of processors. The mobile is really kind of cool to where if you have a bunch of them, it doesn't really take off very well.
So that kind of leads us to our next question, or
Yeah,
is so rumor is that UK is building a new meat lab.
we are. We've had a meat science program since 1919.
Hmm.
And the current building that I'm sitting in right now is over 50 years old. I'm over 50 years old. I need a lot of maintenance, and this building needs a lot of maintenance as well. What you can't see behind me, the big glaring light behind you, if you look out that window, is the hospital. Well, the hospital said, we want to expand into your college.
Hmm.
And so they're expanding into our college, and we're moving across the street over in front of the football stadium. So the athletic people are not real happy with this right now. But part of that is building a new meats lab, and that's it's kind of cool to be involved in that. It's kind of fun to design that. The challenge I'm having is, all right, I'm designing it for what you need now, but remember that I
Future.
want the program to grow. What am I going to leave the person who comes in behind me,
Right.
so trying to get it built big enough to where it can grow and also have equip it to where it can grow as well. We're calling it the Meats and Foods Workforce Development Center. So not only will it be a new meats lab, it will also have the other side of it will be for fruit and vegetable processing, dairy processing. We tried to hit a lot of the big commodities here in the Commonwealth. Uh, you know, to help everybody, not only the meat processing community, but also with the fruit and vegetables as well, and to be able to teach
Hmm.
folks all aspects of it. So it's really exciting. Just a lot of planning and so on and so forth that goes into it. A lot of Monday meetings that last about 2 or 3 hours is what's happening. So plus we got three other buildings we're trying to design as well on campus.
A lot of good stuff going on. I know
Yeah,
it's painful at sometimes, but
yeah, it's kind of like going to the dentist. It's going to hurt a little bit, but in the long run, it's going to be good for you.
so when is the expected opening? And
Oh yeah, like I said, Monday meetings right now of designing it. We hope to have the final design done by Christmas. I would predict that a year from today, we're going to be breaking ground, and probably in 2025, late 2025, maybe 2026, it'll be open.
well,
And the deal our dean had with the medical folks is you can't tear any of this down until we have something to move into. So most of
good.
our other buildings are projected to be done early 2026, and that's kind of the same thing with the meats lab.
No, that's great. And that really helps from the aspect of just teaching and extension and having, up to date meat lab. I know so many universities struggle with that is the funding is not there. The meat lab is, like you said, it was, 50, 60 years old plus,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
it's hard to upgrade. It's hard hard to
yeah.
expand. It's hard to make it where it needs to be. And so that's tremendous that you have that.
Yeah, and we're putting it out. It's going to be about 45 minutes off campus. I say 45 minutes, 45 minutes with traffic and everything else, to get out there. from an extension standpoint, it's an absolute dream. Because people always ask me, well, you always do these meat cutting schools in the summer. Why not through the year? And it's one word: parking.
Yeah.
Parking on college campuses is not the easiest thing to do. So it's going to be a dream from an extension standpoint, because now not only myself, but the food science folks, the beef folks, the pork folks, they can have programs out there and not have to worry about parking. From an
Yeah.
undergraduate standpoint, we're still talking about how we're going to solve that problem. So,
Speaking of extension, and since you've been at it for a while, and
mhm.
we see an influx in new extension specialists and people looking to get in that. So, any recommendations in young faculty that are starting in extension, especially the meat science side, that you learned in your career wise?
The one thing I've learned, and because we don't train people to be extension. I was
Mm,
fortunate because I grew up around extension through 4-H, and so I kind of had a feel for it. Yeah, I was mentored by some extension people when I was at Mizzou, so I kind of came in and knew a little bit about extension. But um, extension is one of those things where even if from the agent level all the way up to the specialist level, you've got to get out. You got to know your farmers. You got to know your meat processors. You got to know your commodity groups. Working with your commodity group, I work with our beef, Kentucky Cattlemen's
mhm,
Association, Kentucky Pork Producers. I work with them. We now have a brand new Kentucky Association of Meat Processors. Working with them, addressing the needs of the state, and also like with me with meat cutting, you know hitting on what you know, and develop a program that you could call exclusively yours, and then always be open to those what we call an extension teaching moments. I had a really unique teaching moment a couple years ago. One of my former students in TA in my class. If you take my class, you'll find out beforehand, before class starts, I play music videos. And the kicker is you have to listen to my music. And I had this young lady come up to me, and she goes, I see you like that hard rock and heavy metal stuff. And I said, I do. And she goes, you like Papa Roach? I said, yeah. And she goes, well, that's my uncle. I said, what? And she, yeah, the lead singer, Jacoby Shattuck, is my uncle. And a couple of years ago, I texted her and I said, hey, I'm going to be in Reno. And she and the whole family's from Folsom, which is about
mhm,
an hour and a half, 2 hours away. So you drive up the Sierra Nevada mountains, back
mhm,
down here in Folsom. So I did see the Folsom prison that
mhm.
Johnny Cash talks about, but it was really interesting is sitting there with her rock star uncle on one side of me, her dad on the other side of me, surrounded by people at the halftime of this football game, extension moment where I was teaching, holding court, holding church, whatever you want to call it. People asking me questions, and that's I always tell folks, that's the fun part of
It
extension.
is.
You never know when you're going to be teaching and stuff like that, and just taking advantage of those teaching moments and developing those grassroots. So I developed some grassroots at a football game in Folsom, California. So that was kind of cool to sit there and talk with a certified rock star. He's a wonderful guy. I mean,
Yeah,
they say don't ever meet your heroes. I tell you, if Jacoby Shattuck is one of your heroes, meet him. He's
that's
just
great.
salt of the earth guy, great guy. I can't speak highly enough about him.
Yeah, it's always interesting in our fields that when someone finds out, you do this,
Yeah.
the questions just start rolling out. And so, you know, so many times they don't even understand or know people are doing, have careers in this.
Yes. Oh yeah.
And so it's a great opportunity to, put out, or put out some of those missed communications, misunderstandings that they believe they've heard or they read that you know, and it's a great opportunity just to talk and to teach.
Absolutely. It was. Yeah. Again, it's amazing to me the misconceptions, and it's funny because when Lucy came back from Thanksgiving break and she was telling me about Jacoby and the class, because my class ends up when the kids leave for Thanksgiving. I always hear every year, your class was something the family talked about. Jacoby was like, "What are you going to school for again? Are you a butcher?" And then
Yeah.
when I've met him a few times, he always brings that up. He's like, "How in the world? I never knew there was such a thing like
Yep.
that."
Yep.
And then I tell him, there are creamery scientists out there, ice cream people, then
Yep.
then all of a sudden they're more interested in
It's
ice cream than they are meats.
yeah.
But yeah, that's yeah. I think I joked with you before we started the show here. Somebody asked me one time, what's the hardest part of your job? And I said, explaining to people what a meat scientist is.
Yeah, and sometimes your own family don't even know exactly what you do,
Oh yeah, yeah.
and so it's funny those conversations you get into because it's not a simple field sometimes, and people are just blown away about you know this field of science that no one knows about. They just think this stuff happened.
Just happens, and all the innovation just happens. And it's really kind of interesting being a PhD. I've actually had family members introduce me with the words, "He says he's a doctor, but he doesn't know anything about medicine." I said, "No, I don't." I
Yeah.
remember one time in mass, Catholic, and I was in mass, and a family in front of me, that one of the boys passed out,
Hmm.
and the doctor, or the dad, looked straight at me because I had a jacket on that had Dr. Rentfrow on it. He looked straight at me and says, "Is there a doctor in the house?" And all I could do is look at him and say, "I can turn him into ground beef, but I don't know how to help you from there on out." But it is kind of fun sometimes,
Yeah,
telling folks about what we do and so on. But yeah, you're right, folks. You know, they just think that things happen.
they
That there's
do.
not any science behind it, but there's a ton and a ton of scientists. I'm actually one of three meat scientists here at UK.
And it may be it's we've not done well from extension of reaching that end of our stakeholders. We're very good at reaching our producers.
Yeah.
We're not always good about how do we reach that other side of the table and communicate and get that information out to them. And I don't think we always do a very good job at that.
We maintain here in Kentucky a very traditional extension program. We have 120 counties, and there's an extension office in each one of them. There's at least three extension, uh, agents in there, 4-H, what we call ANR, Ag and Natural
Mhm.
Resources, and usually an FCS, Family and Consumer Science person in those offices. But you go to other states, and they've gone to a regional
Yep.
system, or not even maybe a district system, and so we don't always. We've kind of lost that down home grassroots extension, office type mentality that used to
Yes.
be that way 50, 60 years ago, where, and I can tell you right now, when it comes to a disaster, like we had bad weather here a few days ago. We had, I think, 6 or 7 F1 tornadoes out of that cell that came through and did some damage. And it was the county agents that were for farmers, and especially when it comes to horses. We had some horse farms get torn up and some horses get injured. And in Kentucky, that's a fairly big deal, but
Yep. Yep.
it's our county agents that were the first on the
Front
scene.
line.
And
Yep.
I can remember about 5 years ago, a F3 tornado went through one of our research stations in the western part of the state. And that agent down there, he dropped everything from his place. He had storm damage to go out and help other people that had damage. And I think some states have lost that. I really
Yeah.
do. And I think that goes back to what you're talking about, is not having that one-on-one like we used to.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, and due to funding reasons, we've seen some of that. Yep.
Yeah.
It's time for our famous three. Beta carotene impacts reproductive performance in cattle. Because the main sources of beta carotene are forages, most cattle don't get enough. Victus Transition from DSM Firmenich contains a blend of beta carotene and mixed tocopherols, which provide needed vitamin A and antioxidants. Victus Transition provides better embryonic transfer and reproductive performance. Make sure your cattle get the beta carotene they need with Victus Transition. Visit dsm.com/Victus Transition.
So to wrap us up, I've got 3 questions for us.
Sure.
And so the first one is, what's your go-to beef-related resource from academia, scientific?
That's one thing that I try to stress to students is what I'm about to say is you don't know everything,
Mhm.
and I don't think you're meant to know everything, even though you have that PhD after your name. And I work a lot with our beef folks. I'm on the second floor of this building. They're on the 8th floor. I went to grad school with one of our beef specialists, and whenever I get into a corner, nutrition wise or just basic common sense, animal husbandry type stuff, I'm upstairs on the 8th floor. Dr. Lim Cooler, my
Mhm.
other 2 beef colleagues, I go to them. One of the things like we talked about earlier, what advice do you give the new specialist? Getting to know your commodity groups, and so from a beef standpoint, our Kentucky Cattlemen's Association, there's a bunch of people over there, wealth of knowledge, and just getting in touch with them. And so I utilize it. Yeah, I could tell you the old adage of this thing,
Mhm.
but in reality, for me, I'm a big fan of face-to-face learning myself, and so I use our beef guys. I use our Cattlemen's Association, and I know a few farmers in the state. I'll ask them as well.
Yeah, using your resources is extremely important. That's probably underutilized.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
So what is one, let's say, book recommendation or resource recommendation that's not ag that you would recommend, someone that's watching this to read, to utilize?
You get to know me. I mentioned earlier, I'm Catholic, and so I read a lot of Catholic books and
Hmm.
that kind of stuff. I'm a big paranormal type guy. My wife was one time. She said, "You don't believe all that Bigfoot stuff, do you?" And I said, "I don't know if I believe it or not. I just like the stories,
Yeah.
for relaxing and just learning outside my head." Those are always places I go for book wise. It's always fun to read about ghost stories throughout Kentucky, especially at Halloween time, But that's usually the type of stuff. If you don't see me with a journal in my hand or reading
Mhm.
something on the internet about the meats industry, you find some sort of Catholic religious book in my hand or something about ghosts, which almost goes the exact opposite. But
Yep. Right.
that's
Right.
just a weird, I wish I could give you some inspirational things like the 7 habits of highly effective people. I had to read that in college, but that's just when I'm just reading to be reading, those are the things I read.
And so, what, in your opinion, what separates someone that's really successful in ag versus someone that's not?
Ooh, that's a good question. Somebody successful in ag is someone that's not. I tell you, it's how you look at it. And I may be off on this one, but um, I like my weekends. I like Fridays, but I don't really look at coming into my office and coming into the lab as a job. I know that sounds cliche, but I think that's the big difference. I look at the other 2 meat scientists I work with, Dr. Yuling Zhang and Dr. Surendranath Suman, and those guys, they're just like me. They don't mind putting in the long hours. They don't view this as a job or a career. And I think that's, those people that truly, truly enjoy what they do. I have a lot of hobbies. I really
Mhm.
do. I do woodworking. I play the guitar, ride motorcycle, mixed martial arts, all that stuff. Or those are hobbies. But my true passion is what I'm doing now. I
Mhm.
find the most reward in what I'm doing is teaching our students in extension and college students as well. So I think it's that it sounds cliche, but it's that passion of what you're doing. If you're just approaching this as a job, or if you're approaching this of what do I need to do to get to the next level, I think you're just missing a whole lot. It's just passion. It's got to have that passion.
No, that's great. That's great. Well, thank you for taking the time and
Yeah.
jumping on the podcast today. I really enjoyed talking to you about the meat science world and cutting and what's going on at Kentucky.
Yeah, this was fun. Thanks for having me on. This is a good way to spend a Friday afternoon. I've heard it now sounds like the floor's quiet.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really fun. But yeah, thanks for having me on. This has been a big joy.